have that feeling sometimes, you know? That sense that someone is watching you when you are alone in your house. I never used to believe in that sort of thing until what happened to me last winter. I live alone in a small house at the edge of town, where the streetlights end and the forest begins. It is peaceful most of the time, just me and my cat Milo. About 3 months ago, a man started coming to my door. He would knock softly at first, then harder if I did not answer. He was thin, with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed too large for his face. He always wore the same tattered gray coat, even as the weather got colder. He would ask for money, food, anything I could spare, but something about him made me uncomfortable. His voice was too smooth for someone who looked so desperate, and he never seemed to blink. I always politely declined and closed the door, making sure to lock it behind me. After the 5th or 6th time, I started to ignore the knocking altogether. I would sit perfectly still on my couch until he gave up and left. One Friday evening, a terrible storm rolled in. The wind howled through the trees, rain pounded against my windows, and the electricity kept flickering on and off. I was curled up on the couch with Milo, trying to read by candlelight, when I heard it. A soft scratching at my door, barely audible over the storm. Then came a voice, pleading, "Please, I know you are in there. I can see your candle. It is freezing out here, I just need to come in for a little while." I froze, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. How could he see my candle? The curtains were drawn. Milo hissed, his fur standing on end as he stared at the door. The scratching continued, growing more frantic. "Please, I am so cold, I will die out here in this storm. Just let me in for a few minutes." I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but there was no signal because of the storm. The scratching stopped abruptly. I waited, listening, but all I could hear was the rain and wind. After what felt like forever, I crept to the door and peeked through the peephole. There was nothing but darkness and rain. I checked again, this time opening the door just a crack with the chain still on. The porch was empty. No sign of anyone. The relief I felt was overwhelming. I closed the door, locked it, and turned around. That is when I saw him. Standing in the middle of my living room, dripping wet, was the beggar. "How did you get in?" I whispered, my voice barely working. He smiled, and his mouth seemed too wide, his teeth too sharp in the flickering candlelight. "You invited me in," he said, his voice no longer pleading, but cold and amused. "I never invited you in," I said, backing away until I hit the door. "You did not have to say it out loud," he replied, stepping closer. "Every time you thought about me, worried about me, feared me, you were inviting me in." His eyes looked different now, darker, as if they were filling with ink. "I live on fear," he continued, reaching out one pale, long-fingered hand. "And you have been feeding me so well." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I fumbled behind me for the doorknob, desperate to escape. The beggar was inches away now, his breath smelling like wet earth and decay. But the oddest thing happened then. Milo, my cat who normally hid from strangers, leapt between us, hissing and spitting with his back arched. The beggar hesitated, actually took a step back. That is when I realized what my grandmother had always told me was true. Animals can see what humans cannot. They know what is natural and what is not. In that moment of distraction, I yanked the door open and ran into the storm, screaming for help. My neighbor, an elderly man who never slept well, heard me and came out with his shotgun. We went back to my house together, but the beggar was gone. All that remained was a puddle of water on my floor and my traumatized cat hiding under the couch. I moved out the next day. I could not stay there knowing he had somehow gotten inside, knowing the locks could not keep him out. Sometimes, especially during storms, I still think I hear scratching at my door, and on those nights, I make sure all my lights are on, and I never, ever answer. Because I know now that some visitors do not need an invitation to enter, they just need you to think about them. And I cannot stop thinking about him, wondering if one day I will turn around and see him standing behind me again, with his too wide smile and ink-black eyes, waiting to feed on my fear once more. I still cannot shake the memory of what happened that night, even months later. I have always found comfort in late-night cigarettes on my porch, something about the quiet darkness, and the gentle glow of ember between my fingers that helps me unwind after a long day. That particular Tuesday night was exceptionally quiet, with a strange stillness in the air that I initially attributed to the lack of wind. I had moved into this house just 3 weeks prior, a small countryside property that offered the solitude I had been craving after years of living in the city with roommates and constant noise. I remember checking my phone. It was 2:17 a.m., and I had been having trouble sleeping, so I decided to step outside for a smoke before trying to fall asleep again. The porch light had burned out the day before, but I did not mind the darkness, as the nearly full moon provided just enough light to see the outline of my yard and the trees that bordered my property. I lit my cigarette, took a deep drag, and leaned against the porch railing, enjoying the silence and the slight chill in the air that made the warm smoke feel even more satisfying as it filled my lungs. As I exhaled, watching the cloud of smoke drift lazily upward, I noticed something odd. Instead of dissipating normally, the smoke seemed to hang in the air, swirling in place about a foot away from my face. I blinked, assuming it was just a strange air current, but when I exhaled again, the smoke behaved even more strangely, curling and twisting until it formed what looked unmistakably like the outline of a human face, just inches from my own. I froze, my cigarette halfway to my lips, as the smoke face hovered before me, 2 hollow eyes, and a gaping mouth clearly visible in the moonlight. What disturbed me most was not just that the smoke had formed a face, but that it seemed to be studying me, the empty eye sockets somehow conveying a sense of intent and awareness that made my skin crawl. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light and shadow. Yet when I waved my hand through it, expecting the smoke to disperse, it reformed almost immediately, the face now appearing more defined, more deliberate in its shape. I could feel my heart pounding as I took another drag, my hand trembling slightly, and when I exhaled again, the smoke joined the floating face, adding more definition to its features, a nose, eyebrows, even what looked like strands of hair, all forming a more complete visage that was undeniably human, yet impossibly present in the empty air before me. I decided I had had enough, and turned to go back inside, but as I reached for the door handle, I felt a sudden cold spot on the back of my neck, as if someone had exhaled a frigid breath directly onto my skin. I spun around, but there was nothing there except the smoke face, which had moved to where I had been standing, still hovering at eye level, still watching me with those empty eye sockets that somehow seemed to hold an ancient, hungry gaze. My cigarette fell from my fingers as I stumbled backward against the door, unable to take my eyes off the face that was now slowly drifting toward me. As it approached, I noticed more smoke beginning to form below it, creating the suggestion of shoulders, then a torso, as if an entire figure was being constructed out of the night air and my own exhaled smoke. I fumbled for the door handle behind me, my fingers numb with fear, and just as the smoke face came within inches of my own, I managed to wrench the door open and practically fell inside, slamming it shut behind me. Through the small window in the door, I could see the smoke figure standing on my porch, a complete human silhouette now, with that same face staring directly at me through the glass. I ran to my bedroom, grabbed my phone, and locked myself in the bathroom, where I spent the rest of the night, too terrified to go back out. When morning came, I cautiously emerged and looked out onto the porch. There was nothing there, of course, just my half-smoked cigarette lying on the wooden boards. I convinced myself it had been an exhaustion-induced hallucination, until I noticed the ash on the porch floor, scattered in a pattern that unmistakably resembled a footprint, too large to be my own. I have not smoked on that porch since, or anywhere else for that matter. But sometimes, when I am alone in the house at night, I catch a faint whiff of cigarette smoke coming from outside, and when I gather the courage to peek through the curtains, I can see a thin trail of smoke rising from the porch railing, forming that same face that now haunts both my waking hours and my dreams, watching, waiting for me to step outside again, for what I can only imagine would be one final cigarette. There is something about the silence of a house at night that makes every little sound feel like a warning. I have always been the type to wake up at odd hours, but that night in December, I wish I had just stayed asleep. It was exactly 3:17 a.m. when my eyes snapped open for no apparent reason. The house was completely silent, except for the soft hum of the heater fighting against the winter cold. My parents were away for the weekend, visiting my aunt in the next state over, and I had convinced them I was old enough to stay home alone at 17. The house felt different without them, bigger somehow, with more shadows and corners where the darkness seemed thicker. After tossing and turning for about 10 minutes, I decided to get up and get some water. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I made my way down the hallway, the moonlight streaming through the windows. Our house sits at the edge of the woods, and normally I love the privacy, but that night the trees looked like tall, lurking figures waiting just beyond the glass. As I passed by the living room window, something caught my eye, a disturbance in the perfect blanket of snow that had fallen earlier that evening. At first, I thought maybe it was just a shadow, but as I moved closer to the window, I could clearly make out footprints in the snow, leading from our back door and disappearing into the tree line. Fresh footprints that had not been there when I went to bed at 11. My blood turned to ice in my veins as I realized what I was seeing. Someone had been at our house, or worse, someone had been inside our house and left. I checked all the doors and windows. They were locked, just as I had left them before going to bed. But the footprints were undeniably there, a single line of them, like someone walking with purpose from our house into the woods. What disturbed me most was that there were no footprints coming toward the house, only away from it, as if whoever had made them had materialized inside our home. As I stood frozen by the window, I noticed something else. The footprints seemed to be slowly disappearing, not like they were being covered by new snow, but like they were sinking deeper into the snow, being swallowed up. That is when I heard it, a soft thud from upstairs, like something heavy being set down. My room. The sound came from my room. I decided to check the kitchen for a weapon first, my hands shaking as I pulled a large knife from the drawer. As I crept back toward the stairs, I noticed something that turned my fear to absolute terror. There were wet footprints on the stairs, leading up, footprints that had not been there when I came down. They were small, like a child's, but there was something off about their shape, too narrow, with toes that seemed longer than they should be. I backed away from the stairs when the lights went out, all at once, plunging the house into darkness. The only illumination came from the moon outside, casting just enough light for me to make out a small figure at the top of the stairs. It was roughly the size of a child, but its proportions were all wrong. Limbs too long and thin, head slightly too large. It stood completely still, watching me. Then it spoke, not with a child's voice, but with a voice that sounded like multiple people whispering at once. It knew my name. It said it had been watching me for a long time, waiting for me to be alone. It said it had been inside the house all along, hiding in the spaces between the walls where people never look. It said others like it were waiting in the woods, and now that I had seen the footprints, they would come for me too. I ran out the front door into the snow, barefoot and terrified, not even feeling the cold as I sprinted to my neighbor's house. They called the police, who found nothing in my house, no intruder, no footprints inside. But the line of footprints leading from our back door to the woods was there, just as I had seen them. The police said they were probably animal tracks distorted by the moonlight. My parents came home early, and we stayed with relatives until we could sell the house. I never went back inside after that night. Sometimes I still wake up at exactly 3:17 a.m., and I swear I can hear that voice whispering from somewhere very close, telling me that they are still waiting, still watching, and one day, I will be alone again.